What is up, y'all? It's your boy Aniki coming at you with the latest My Hero Academia chapter review. My Hero Academia chapter 321 from Class 1A to 1-4 all. Hope you guys have been doing well coming back. Now, as you already know, if you've been here before, we do the page-by-page breakdowns. So let's get right into it. I don't want to waste your time. So, opening color page, everybody putting together the All Might Mag. It's important to note that you got Katsuki with the clipboard, leading the charge, everybody else putting things together, looking to, and a lot of people actually facing him actively as if that's implying he's giving some direction. So, but it's important to note that Endeavor is actually on the scene. And with Endeavor here, we get confirmation that the kids do have extra bonus security. This does, however, also mean that UA is a lot more vulnerable, because if they sent Endeavor, that means Ingenious is possibly in the area too. Then they've got a high consolidation of power within this small area, so the Camino district at least is rather safe, though people who don't trust heroes don't even want them there. Something to think about, as that's why Endeavor does call them hero-hating civilians. And we see that Kirishima actively does want to talk to Deku, but him having a quirk that isn't focused around movement or anything like that really restricts him from being a major player within this plan. This kind of has been highlighted throughout the series, that Kirishima is uncomfortable and saddened by his quirk, and it limits him in a lot of ways, and because it's unimpressive, he doesn't get to be as useful in as many scenarios. And so this is kind of just that same arc coming back into play, him only being able to really help out in such a small way. So he still charges off. We see Toru and Aoyama, so people who were worried about them not being there can now rest assured they were in fact there. And specifically, Endeavor also gives Hawks the cue to not interfere, which means there's probably more than one or two heroes actually in the area. Now, Shoto says something that I've had to argue with people about extensively over these past couple of weeks, which is that, yes, in fact, Deku being away from UA does not protect UA. All for One can easily want Deku to be out there worn out, tired, go destroy UA because he's petty, just to cause Deku suffering. After all, this is the guy who looked at All Might and had not expected to die, and initially was just training Tomura Shigaraki to be a villain, just to spite his enemies. Destroying UA is not out of the question. This is the guy who referred to the dead corpses as grapes that he could juice for wine. Sorry, he can press them. So, Shoto's pointing out the fact that everything Deku's doing is kind of spinning in the palm of All for One's hand, and Deku's excuse is basically that they can't keep up, they're not going to be fast enough. And the reality is that they just destroyed one of the subordinates of All for One like it was nothing. So it's worth noting that while he's saying they can't keep up, in a lot of ways where it matters, they will be more than enough. So we get Tsu pulling in, and Uraraka gets sent off by Iida, but we don't actually see what she's doing right away. Instead, we get to focus in on what Tsu's doing, and she pulls Mineta in, who actually manages to attach his sticky balls to Midoriya. And then Mineta explains that it's not this super dark, quote, dark version of Deku who goes out of his way to be alone and be super strong. That's not the Deku that Mineta became friends with and was, so like cool, thought was so cool. It was the Deku who was breaking his limbs while he was trying to fight, but still going headlong into the danger, administering justice and working together with his friends to make sure they all could come out safely and work together. I'm not going to get into the whole, technically he used the term horate, which can mean that it's romantic love. I'm sure everybody's tired of it. There was like 100,000 tweets about it. Everybody's talked about whether or not Mineta has a crush on Deku enough. If he has one, cool. If he doesn't, cool. Leave it at that. And so I think a lot of people thought that Uraraka was going to be here to focus on trying to confess her feelings to Deku or have some kind of random moment. But that wasn't the case here. Instead, her priority was more over on getting and being a part of the reason why Deku ended up in a certain location, and so that she could enable the major player. And it's important to note that she is consciously making the effort to enable Iida, as we see later in the chapter. As she goes, now guys, her original role was just to scout and be in the way. And it's worth noting that Deku did stack all of his quirks so that he could use full 100% here. So he uses it to fly off, And then that's when we get the ultimate combo move. We get to see that Acid Man has a protective style that she can use for her allies, where there's not a bunch of acids so they're not burned. Todoroki actually can use Flash Freeze Heat Wave more on command now, has better control, and uses it for propulsion. We see that Uraraka is capable of tagging Iida in time to make sure that he loses the gravity. Shoto does have a bit of petty energy when he says, so you say we can't keep up. And the important thing here is, and I'm pretty sure it's Uraraka's monologue, she says, the important thing is that we don't want to be protected. We're trying, or reject who you are and what you're doing. We're trying to be your friends and be by your side. And we see that Bakugo can now use the the star shot explosions more reliably. One of the things that I thought was really cool though about this is that when you look closely, you can see that Bakugo's fingertips have like a little charge up on them. And so it's like he's got, the explosions are starting around each of his fingertips plus inside of his palm. So there's a bunch of small, really condensed fingertip sized explosions that are making, or focused explosions. So that's just something to keep in mind there. But what Bakugo says here is what's mostly important, not just the cool techniques and the small details in the art, but also he says that he definitely has a lot that he needs and must say to Deku. But right now, the person who needs to go there is Iida. He's the fastest. He's the one that, at the end of the day, has been Deku's friend. But at the end, if Deku wants to run ahead, then he needs someone who can run even faster or go up in front of him. And so here, as they're flying through the air and they launch Iida, we finally get the explanation to the end of the second user's speech, which is that if there's anything that could bolster Izuku Midoriya right now, it would be those who share his resolve and those who can match his pace. And the reasoning for this, and it's important to note that the second user is going to have probably what I would consider the best perspective on One For All out of all of the users. The first user just happened to have the power and gave it to him as just something that he could use to fight against All For One as he was fading. This is just how he saw it, as the power that he was passing on in hopes that it would one day take on his brother. But the second user is somebody who had already been organizing fights. He had already been a leader. He'd already been processing and trying to work together with people. So of all the One For All users, he probably sees it as the least special. And in turn, what he sees it as is an asset in the war against All For One, but that war has to be fought with or without One For All, which in turn means that people who do or don't want to have One For All still need to rise up to the battle, which means they still have value and a place on the field. This is important because it means that unlike every other One For All user who likely was focused on, like the third user, for example, would have been likely trying to live up to what he saw as his leader's last mission, and thus he would have been more focused on that. Shinomori, when he got the quirk, immediately saw that he didn't have a chance at winning, so he just spent his life investing in the future users and building up the quirk. The Banjo likely saw that power as like, I need to be taking out One For All, because Shinomori might have ran, but he might have thought, well, with 18 years sacrificed by Shinomori, I should put an end to this. So each of them saw One For All. So the fifth user would have seen One For All as something to put down All For One and get the job done. And then he almost lost it. The same happened with the sixth user, where he almost lost it. And then he gave it to Nana while missing that arm, And so Nana saw One For All as her responsibility to take out All For One, and if she should fail, to pass that mission to Toshinori. And Toshinori, when he received it, also saw it as that mission statement in the quirk to become the symbol of peace. But every single person has seen One For All as a mission and a goal and an idea, and the second user is the only person who has seen that power as an asset, as a piece of what they are and who they are and what they're about and what they're fighting for. And so this in turn makes it so that he's the one who, more than anything, wants to see Deku have his allies. And I don't think that this will be the time he gets the quirk back. As I mentioned before, the chair metaphor seems to imply that whoever sits down in the vestige world is going to be giving Deku their quirk. I don't think that Deku gets his quirk back just because he's willing to work with his friends. I think he has to not only be willing to work with them, but then also start to work and gather and foster his actual leadership again and actually become a leader they can rely on, not just because he's got One For All, but because he's actually making the right calls and plays. Because one of the other things that this fight does highlight is that if they were managed to catch up to Deku as a class 1A, then if a bunch of assassins are working with All for One, then they have the ability to also do this same game with Deku with the right strategizing. And even more importantly, though, I've always believed and said that by having Iida, by having these characters come here and make these attachments to Deku, we are allowed to have a far more dangerous, high stakes scenario coming after this than we would have had if Deku would have been alone. And now, with the UA being mentioned, whether it's turning into Nezu's House of Horrors, that is specifically what I would actually like. Is if Nezu's House of Horrors is the next arc that we go forward to with here, especially because it would mean fighting somebody who can do what Class 1A just did here with Deku if they have to fight their way through. They strategized, corralled, ultimately helped predict his route, and then accurately built the ramps and everything needed in a quick fashion to make sure that they could optimize and speed up and catch up to him, knowing that this was always going to be the plan. And you can tell that they knew this was going to be the plan because at the start of chapter 320, even though Bakugo is leading the charge in vocals, the internal speech that we hear first and the first perspective we see is Tenya Iida's. Now, it's easy to lose track of Iida during the Rise of the Villain Saga because that was about a 200 chapter stretch, and that was, the majority of the story so far has been in the Rise of the Villain Saga. So it's easy to lose track of the value that Iida actually has. But when you look at the way Iida was the one who acknowledged him as soon as he got into the class by telling him he was a superior student, supporting him as class rep, only for Deku to return that same respect. Deku being the one to go run and try to save All Might, Iida being the ones who run and get All Might during USJ, the Host of City incident where Deku's blinded by his rage to go get a villain, and then in turn of Kamino when Deku goes out and is making the same risk, taking the same risk that Iida was making. They've had this iron sharpens iron back and forth throughout the entirety, and then even looking at the way he challenged him during the sports festival. And then after Deku was eliminated, he just simply said, I'll try to use what you learned, what I learned from your fight, and hopefully make something of that. There's always been this respect, and it's the same thing that happened between Bakugo and Kirishima. When you think about how Kirishima was acknowledging that Bakugo was strong during the battle training, and then you think about them working together during the USJ to take on the villains. They've had those same boss, and then you look at the cavalry battle in the sports festival, plus them actually getting to square off in the sports festival. There's constantly been that same building up that led to Kirishima and Bakugo having a respect for each other that made reaching out possible here, and it's the same thing that's happened with Iida and Deku here. At the end of the day, when Deku saw Iida go as fast as he did and surpass Gran Torino, he was like, I need to train with Iida so I can learn to be more like Iida. And in turn, but Iida was doing that specifically because, and having to level up because Deku started using shoot style. So even during provisional license exam, there's a bit of an emphasis on that iron sharpening iron. It's just something that we don't, or sorry, not provisional license, joint training. And we still just don't think about it. And so Iida has been kind of building up in this background, and when he finally quotes, giving help that's not asked for is what makes a true hero, calling back to the Host of City incident where Deku uses the excuse that he's getting meddling where he doesn't have to, but that's because he's a hero. When you see, he talks about how when he was younger, and Jinyo mentioned that people who go and help a lost child get saved are the coolest, and if you think back to what Shigaraki was, a lost child that nobody ever reached the hand out to, this is partially building up to what's going to allow them to hopefully try to reach out to Shigaraki. You could also argue that this is a death flag on Iida, especially since he already had that issue where he was running at the war arc and he wasn't supposed to be there, and he just simply was like, I accept the responsibility. And when you look into joint training, him being ready to sacrifice himself to make sure he could throw Shoto to safety even though the building was still falling on him. So there's some of this self-sacrifice being built up within Iida, but this dedication and leadership is also there. Just lots of callbacks. This chapter kind of separates in a lot of ways where if you enjoyed this chapter and you acknowledge okay, Iida's glasses broke, which was partially a reference to back when they had the room contest, you got these references to the Remedial Course arc where they said next time let's make an explosion turbo powered roller coaster. or like fire and ice explosion roller coaster, and now you have the flash freeze heat wave, referencing the remedial course arcs. The small slice of life moments, if you paid attention to those, if you got invested in those, if you're willing to care about the characters beyond just whether they were punching or kicking, these last 2 chapters especially have started to have a lot of payoff for you. And it's what makes my hero my hero. Being willing to be in these situations where maybe 2 people aren't trying to fight. They don't need to be trying to beat the crap out of each other. That doesn't actually accomplish what their goals are. And I think it's odd, and like to a certain degree, because it's a shonen, you would expect them, okay, they're going to have a battle, because anime loves to just have people fight it out. But the fact that they more or less ended up having an obstacle race, or with Iida and at the point, essentially, that makes a lot more sense. And now that he's caught up to Deku in a way, gone past him, we can finally move forward in the plot for real and actually start addressing what we need to do to move forward. Deku alone isn't going to be able to find all the answers. There's still things like mutant discrimination that he didn't properly register as a discriminatory act or thought process that he's only probably going to be able to recognize and fully experience and understand if he has people like Tokoyami and Shoji around him. The weight of expectations of being a gifted child and all these other things is things he can finally relate to, but only because of the burden of One for All, which is a part of what lets him be closer to Kachan. Overall, where we're going with these characters, and Uraraka once again not focusing on her romance and Bakugo not focusing on his guilt, we're going to be going into the psyche of these characters. And a lot of people were talking about how they were upset that post-war we didn't get a lot of focus on the student's psyche because Deku rushed off to do something else and we spent time with Deku alone. But now that we do have that, it's just a matter of when things come, not always being in the exact order that you expect them to be, because at the end of the day, when it's post-war and Deku's going to be on the run, if we would have spent time sitting there listening to them talk about stuff while he was running around, people would have been pretty upset. So I just want to know what you guys thought about this chapter. Let me know what you guys think. I enjoyed this. This is what I read My Hero Academia for. This is one of the most exciting chapters I've read in a long time, and it managed to actually get me out of my seat during the live reaction. So if you want to watch that, that's always available too. Church of MHA on normal Sundays. Don't think we'll be doing a live stream this Sunday since Jump got moved to Monday due to the end of the Olympics, but it is what it is. I hope to see you guys all on the next video. I'm Aniki, and I'm out.